Let's talk about Jujutsu Kaisen Chapter 244. Last week we left on the giant cliffhanger of Yuta chopping off Kenjaku's head, but we don't see that at all this week. Instead, we get right back to Higuruma and Yuji fighting Sukuna. And this chapter, there's a lot of law talk, but to be honest, not all of it is that important, at least not for this chapter, so I might skim over some of those parts, but the main takeaway comes at the end with Yuji Itadori having the continued trial where Sukuna is going to be the real culprit. But before we talk about that, let's talk about the most important bits from this chapter. And this chapter opened up with Yuji and Higuruma jumping in right on Sukuna, but before we see them land, we get a bit of a flashback. Once again led by Kusakabe, the all-knowing, and personally, I love Kusakabe. He's just a character that knows exactly where he stands in the verse. Kusakabe knows he is not a Gojo or a Yuta, he's not a powerhouse for their team, and the most useful place for him is right here. And we get the full explanation of their whole Yuta assassination of Kenjaku plot, and that seems to be the whole plan here. It's a pretty smart one. But the biggest thing that Kusakabe is worried about here is that they can't have Yuta away from the battlefield for too long. And I think a big reason for the sneak attack is because you really can't risk having Yuta be injured against Kenjaku. You really don't want the leader of your heaviest hitters against Sukuna to come in at like 40% power. And we get some more funny dialogue from Kashimo where he says that this is an all-out battle, why are we sending in people one at a time, that's all going in at once except me first. And Kusakabe brings up the good point that more bodies does not necessarily mean a higher chance at victory. And Kashimo thinking he'll win against Sukuna, that is kind of played for comedy this chapter, but Kashimo, his technique was cracked. When he activated this thing, even Ryomen Sukuna was like, what the fuck? If he was a little bit less of an orc and more of a man and decided to actually work alongside them, then perhaps he could have done a bit more for the team. But after this, we see Kusakabe actually bring up the merger for a bit, and he tells us the important information that a sorcerer can actually survive temporarily. And that is great news for them, but unfortunately, 99% of people are not sorcerers, and there's like a handful of them across the planet in general. But this is some alarming setup because they're just telling us that even if the world-ending event happens, these characters are going to be okay. And personally, I always thought that Kenjaku was bluffing about the merger, but with this kind of dialogue in his last words, it's starting to sound like he's going to make a loophole to pull this thing off. But Noritoshi Kamo steps up and says, sorry bro, I'm out. I'm not going to be a part of this whole plan. And I see a lot of people saying that he's just a wimp that doesn't want to fight, but honestly, who can blame him? He is not a powerhouse. He wants to take his family and go overseas because he thinks the end of the world is going to happen, and really, what part is he going to play in stopping Sukuna? Choso is just a straight-up superior version of Noritoshi Kamo's blood manipulation, okay? I'll just say it. And Choso's whole family got murdered and or eaten by Yuji, so he has nothing to lose. And Kusakabe doesn't even berate him for not wanting to participate. He says it would be more of a miracle if he would actually be useful. But there's some interesting dialogue from Yuji when he says that Kamo was a good teacher unlike Choso, and they both have blood manipulation, so people are starting to think that Yuji might have his own. And I'm pretty on board with this, especially since it is pretty much guaranteed at this point that he has eaten the Death Wound paintings. And we also get the most heavily memed discussion piece here, where it turns out that Miwa back in Shibuya with her binding vow on the katana can never swing a katana again. And personally, I never made videos about a Miwa awakening, so I am in the clear on this one. I only ever gas Kashimo, and so what if he got turned into a waffle? If I could go back in time and do it all over again, I would. But Miwa is pretty much just comedic relief for the rest of Jujutsu Kaisen, unless something crazy happens. But we get the most important dialogue in this when Higuruma finally speaks up and says, I am going to seize Sukuna's technique. And they spend a lot of time going over Sukuna's various crimes and trying to find out what will give him the maximum sentence of the death penalty. Because that would equal confiscation on Sukuna's curse technique and the executioner's sword to potentially one-shot him. And while they are trying to find out what he would be liable for within the laws of Japan, Yuji comes up with an idea and he says there might be a way to get the death penalty on Sukuna. Before we cut back to the present where Higuruma brings down the hammer on the gravel around Sukuna. And Yuji, channeling his inner Toji like he is trying to kill some rabbits, punches this debris to break it apart into tiny projectiles. While Higuruma restrains Sukuna's hand holding the Kamatoke so Yuji can enter melee. And Sukuna does take note of what Yuji is doing to him here, so it might be blood manipulation. That's what a lot of people are thinking. It could be little projectiles, but we'll see. But after this, Yuji Itadori revs up a punch against Sukuna, who blocks with 3 arms but immediately feels a tremor throughout his body. And he is visibly confused by this, and in internal dialogue wonders what was that before Higuruma opens up his domain. And they are pulled right into deadly sentencing, and honestly, this is one of the coldest domain opens I have seen in a long time. And we get the reveal, this is going to be the continued trial of Yuji Itadori. Because in order to get the maximum sentence on Sukuna, they have to prove that he was the true culprit of Yuji's crimes. And we see Sukuna give the biggest "I'm about to lawyer up" grin I have ever seen, and the chapter ends. And I want to talk about the fact that the only reason this court trial was able to continue is because Yuji gave a false confession. But now we see that it is Yuji who brings up that Sukuna is actually the one responsible for this crime, and really, he doesn't blame himself anymore. And I think a huge part of that is that he now has a mirror to what he went through with Sukuna by seeing Megumi be taken over right in front of him. The actions Sukuna does inside of Megumi don't reflect on Megumi himself, and I think Yuji finally understands that it is not his fault for what happened in Shibuya. And right now, I think that Yuji might be their only chance at reaching Megumi's soul, because Yuji is the only one that truly understands what Megumi is actually going through. And really, I don't think this whole Executioner's Sword plan is going to work out, because the likelihood of a Sukuna death by instant kill is just so low. And even though Mei revealed this chapter that her crows are ridiculously overpowered and able to kind of distract Sukuna, which is crazy in itself, I don't think even they will be enough to turn the tide on their own. Yuji's current power-up likely revolves around the soul as well, and Sukuna's true weakness, it is highly likely to be the soul. They constantly bring up throughout the story that Sukuna cannot heal damage to his soul, and he is ferocious in defending it. It is undeniably an incredibly powerful soul, but once it is damaged, it is probably hard to fix. And whatever Yuji was doing to Sukuna here, this is really just the front runner. We're going to see far more than this, I'm sure. Some people think this might be a perfected form of Divergent Fist and not just blood manipulation, and honestly, it could be both. And it sounds like Sukuna knows what this is, he's just shocked to see it coming from Yuji. And Yuji's power-up and appearance could also be related to him being like a cursed object himself, soaked in Sukuna's cursed energy. And while Yuji and Sukuna have always looked a little similar to each other, Yuji's new aesthetic is starting to resemble Sukuna even more. And really, at this point, it is less of a question of if Yuji is related to Sukuna in some way, and more of how he is related to him. And two of the biggest theories around this is that Yuji and Sukuna, they are the same person, and Yuji is simply made from him. Or that Kenjaku brought both Yuji and Sukuna back from the Heian era in different ways, and they are twin brothers that were constantly in conflict. And personally, I like the idea of them being brothers. It explains why Sukuna hates Yuji so much if he was capping his power as his twin. And if Sukuna is on trial and he did kill his brother for power in the past, that is one of the greatest crimes he could have. And even if both of those theories are not true, I think whatever Yuji has cooking up for him is going to be satisfying. And speaking of cooking, Maki is completely missing from this chapter. She is nowhere to be seen, and when she does show up, it is probably going to be in another sneak attack. She has the Split Soul Katana or Soul Cutter's Sword, one of the strongest curse tools in the series and one that is potentially dangerous to Sukuna. And characters in JJK, oh boy, they sure do love losing their arms, and Sukuna, he's got arms to spare. And if Maki pops out with the Split Soul Katana and lops off a Sukuna arm, that shit might not grow back. It would also be an easy way to confirm to the reader and to the characters in the story that he cannot heal damage to the soul, and that chopping off Sukuna's head with this thing, that might not be the best idea unless you want to put a permanent end to Megumi as well. And speaking of a permanent end, this will probably be the fight that Higuruma dies. Higuruma is a pretty interesting character. He's a character I like a lot, and despite the fact that he has a high potential as a sorcerer, some characters just have to die here, and he's just not that important to the overall story, even if he has a cool aesthetic and a cool power. And once Maki actually shows up, I imagine Yuta is going to show up right after her, because he is on his way according to Kusakabe. Some people think that Kenjaku is going to kill him, but they're definitely setting up a merger apocalypse with a Sukuna final boss. But the way Kenjaku makes it sound, he doesn't have to be alive for that to happen, so I really do think he's probably done here. Mahito's idol transfiguration is gone after he used the Uzumaki in Shibuya. And while yes, he is technically just a brain in a jar, Yuta is staring right at him, and Yuta is practically at 100% here. And Kenjaku, he definitely didn't want this head to go flying. This was not part of the great plan. The amount of hoops he would have to jump through to clear Yuta here just seemed a little ridiculous, and he would truly be the him of all time. So I think that Kenjaku will probably pop off another Culling Games rule or something else, but as a character, he's probably dead here. He makes it sound like his overall plan does not require him to be alive, and really it just sounds like Kenjaku in the first place. He would definitely plan for his death. especially when they make it sound like Gojo was just up in the clouds waiting for Kenjaku to leave Sukuna's side the entire month. But as for my overall thoughts on this chapter, I think this chapter is excellent. We get some pretty great character interactions, some pretty good setup for the future of the series on top of Yuji getting a power-up reveal. Not every chapter is going to be the climax to a battle or a storyline, and as far as setup chapters go, this is really all I could ask for. JJK is on a 1-week break, but this chapter gave everybody a lot to talk about, so I doubt anyone's going to be bored. And if you like content like this, subscribe for more. And as always, thanks for watching.